Hello.
Hi, Dave.
Hey,
Steve
Steve.
here.
What's going on, brother? How you doing?
Very good. Thank you. I'm very happy. Thank you.
Well, first and foremost, a big aloha and mahalo. We got to talk to you a few years ago, and it's just great to have you
Yeah.
back on the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Nice to be back.
And before we get into the book, let's start with the pandemic because obviously it's touching everyone's lives. Talk about where you are now, where you've been during this, and how all that you've been seeing, hearing, and experiencing has affected you and touched you.
Well, yes, I mean, we are officially in lockdown, although restrictions are being eased. You can argue that that's not a terribly wise thing because, the beaches are crammed full of people, but the disease is not going away and there's no cure for it. But I'm personally trying to avoid people. And although I'm not doing shows at the moment, I was booked to do masses of shows this year. Um, I've switched horses, and we're doing lots of recordings. So I'm stockpiling things for release. There's a live album coming out after the book. I think in September there'll be a live album from Hammersmith, Selling England by the Pound, Spectral Mornings, and At the Edge of Light. So as well as that long definitive show with all those favorite albums, I'm basically getting very close to finishing an acoustic stroke orchestral album, and then I'll have a week off and I'll start getting back to a rock album that I'm making. I'm a couple of tracks into that, so there are lots of things that the factory fires are burning overtime to remain productive in this time where I know a lot of people have given up and said, "Oh, life will never be the same again." And I think, well, I don't think that's true. I know they're developing a vaccine, certainly in this country, that they hope to have available freely for everybody in October. So I remain optimistic. I can't believe that the world is going to be held to ransom just because we don't have the science, the technology, or the goodwill. We have to be able to do that and provide it for everybody because we're all affected by everyone else.
Are you in England? Where exactly are you?
I'm in England. I'm in Greater London. London is a very big city.
Yeah.
It's spread out. We're about 12 miles outside the centre of London.
Okay, great. So that's where
So
you've been during
it,
this whole thing?
yeah, it's still London. It's on the Thames. Yeah, West London.
Okay. And you've been in that location since the crisis began?
Yeah, that's right. We were touring in the States, and states, but individual states were closing down. Theatres were being closed on us. Um, my wife and I got the last flight back from Philadelphia the
Wow.
day after the band. It was literally the last flight back, or we might still be out there. Um, so yeah, it's been extraordinary, but it's been a very productive time. So I think the way to see this is you might be very bored at home. So it's a good time to go and write that novel, paint that picture, write that play, make that record, whatever it is, you know.
Like you've laid a great
Mm.
example with all the projects you've been
Yeah.
busy with. I'm very, very impressed. You totally are a man of your word when you have been applying your creative talent. So the dates that you were doing, it sounds like, were blown out and rescheduled for when? When are you planning on that happening?
Well, we're looking at something like April next year.
Okay.
Um, so it kicks off around then. There's no official word on the European stuff at the moment. Some places are not as firmly in lockdown as others. So there's a question mark against things, but we'll definitely be doing this next year. As I say, I hope that we get to be part of this thing with the COVID response. We hope that there's going to be a vaccine. It looks very likely from the people that are working with Oxford, the developers of this. We are saying that what normally took 6 months is now taking 6 hours, apparently. So this team is working overnight to make this happen. They seem to be very confident that this is going to work. So I've got to remain optimistic because Um, I'm too young to retire. What can I tell you?
You got way too much going on, my brother.
Yeah,
You make people sound tired just hearing about all your plans.
I know, I know. I
And
tire people just by being me. But then, what
by
can I tell you?
with your great energy. I love it. I love it. Well, and one final question before we talk about a Genesis in my bed, which is just filled
Sure.
with great stories. Beyond just the virus, obviously, I don't have to tell you, we've had a couple of major U.S. crises go global. The Black Lives Matter and police reform kicked into international mode following the killing of George Floyd. Now in the United States, we have something of a mask culture war. Or do you have any opinions on any of these issues? Have any of these things touched you?
It's very worrying, the war on the press, and I see films of journalists being attacked by police, and it's vicious. Now, um, there is a danger that America is the big inclusive country. It's the hope for the world. At the end of the day, multiculturalism is exemplified by the whole of America's history. Now, if suddenly America isn't big enough to be able to contain what's within its borders, it cannot lead the world. Um, Here's me saying that. Hey, I just hope that wrongdoers will be punished. No one should be in a position of having power without responsibility. Um, yeah, you're not doing your job if that's the way it's working. Um, you've got to honor the contract. You're there to protect. You're not there to attack. Um, Black lives do matter. Um, it's hugely important that we try and redress that. It's a huge issue, not just there, but in this country too. It's across the board. Um, More and more things are coming to light. In this country, police guys are being sacked um, almost on a daily basis. This is what's happening. So it's a new broom sweeping clean. The change is going to come. Um, Martin Luther King was right about that, for sure. Um, Having come from an immigrant family myself at the turn of the century, from the 19th century into the 20th century, my mother's side of the family were Jewish immigrants who were allowed into the country, worked like crazy to eke out a living. And I hope for immigrants everywhere that what I hope doesn't continue is the idea that the shocking statistic that is that there are 79.5 million people who've been displaced, who are refugees because of war. This is a huge statistic that is not a popular one, but we can't have one world or one half of the world in a privileged position and the rest in a prison camp. We cannot do that. Um, I don't want to see pictures of kids, who haven't got a pot to what in, and they have no home and they're just being covered by some tarpaulin if they're lucky. Um, that's not the kind of world we want.
Right on. It's powerful.
Yeah,
Well, it's and you've done some pretty moving work too, including touching on the Middle East conflict and lots of other issues
yeah,
throughout your career, which I admire you for. And when you mentioned a
yeah,
really important thing in there, talking about your mom,
yeah.
and Steve has this Steve Hackett, of course, from Genesis and GTR, and so many great solo projects. A Genesis in My Bed. Steve, we're going to leave it for our readers to stumble upon the meaning of the title when they
Yeah.
peruse the book themselves. But talking about mom and dad, I look at like dad as a multi-instrumentalist, mom's family having generations of harmonica players and other
Mm.
musicians, and I think of
Yeah.
your own life. What role do these factors have they played in your own musical development, including starting on the harmonica at 2?
Well, that was just something very natural for me. My dad played a number of instruments just for fun. He played bugle in the boys' brigade, and he could play a bit of clarinet, a bit of one-finger piano. Um, all importantly, he brought a guitar back from Canada in 1958-59 with a selection of cowboy tunes that he'd learned, and that really kicked me off on guitar. But yeah, harmonica was all important. even now, I think harmonica is a fantastic instrument. I got to know Larry Adler a little bit at one point, and I was asking him for tips on harmonica playing. Um, I love the harmonica, believe me. Either the style that he played. Um, I'm thinking like I saw him sit down and play one hand on the piano and one other hand on the harmonica, and he's
Wow.
playing Rhapsody in Blue. He could do that
Wow.
as a party piece. And he was old enough to have known George Gershwin and said George Gershwin said to him, "You preferred that version to the orchestral version." Now, whether that's true or not, I have to say that it was an impressive version. And that I was also lucky enough to see Paul Butterfield in the mid 1960s playing with a band that had Mike Bloomfield, who he was famous for working um, with Bob Dylan. He was Dylan's favorite guitarist of all time.
At Eel
And
Pie.
Eel Pie Island, yeah, you've looked at this book, that's for sure. And
Co-
Elvin Bishop, and
yep.
all of them were on fire that night. They were incredible. That was a great, great blues band, fantastic. So I've been playing harmonica all my life, and I didn't understand at all the sound that Paul Butterfield was producing out of one tiny little, the size of the blues harps, the Echo Super Vampers and marine bands. They're tiny,
Right.
not even 6 inches big, but he seemed to be producing limitless notes and tones out of this thing, and it's a kind of miracle, and it can give a lot of rock guitarists a run for their money. Believe me, it's a very, very powerful sound.
I liked also on the note of the guitar, which obviously you're much more well known for, but anyone who reads the
Yeah,
book is going to find out that you have this deep love for the harmonica. I like the explanation of the discovery of the tapping on the guitar as a technique that connects you to classical. You wrote as being Bach-like, and it made me think about when people listen to your style of music and think of some of the things you've brought. What do you think of fellow tappers that came later in life, like Eddie Van Halen and Stanley Jordan? Have you ever interacted with them?
yes. I've not spoken to them, but I know that Eddie Van Halen has acknowledged that he saw me doing tapping first. Now Eddie is a fabulous player, as is Stanley, and that's incredible. And to watch him tap on two guitars, um, so it's a technique, and it's become the mainstay of shredders when they want to do a fast
Right.
salvo of notes. Um, Basically, you're using the fretboard as a keyboard, so it's a bit like democracy. You can go anywhere with that. It's yeah. There's not one note is any more powerful than the other, and then it's all a question of how many fingers you can incorporate into it. Funnily enough, I've been doing some tapping on the nylon guitar, and that's making a very strange sound, but it's a very interesting technique, and it can be done. You need your strings ideally to be very close to the fretboard to do that. But this is for guitarists only, for guitarist ears only.
Right. No, I
Yeah,
know, and I just was curious on the note of just if you had, because we've had Stanley on the show a few times. He plays here, and he's
really.
been in the studio and stuff,
Mm.
and so there's another cat that factors into the book in a couple of different ways. It's neat because there's in the beginning it comes up, then way later. You had the chance later in life to work with Brian May of Queen, and also relating to Queen earlier in the book, have some cool encounters you mentioned with Freddie Mercury, and one early non-musical one that's kind of cool I was hoping you'd retell, but then another you referred to as
Yeah.
happening when you were recording with GTR at the Townhouse.
Mm.
In short, can you share both of your Freddie Mercury stories with us, and
Oh,
any others about that revered guy?
yeah. Well, um, I don't know if people know this, but he used to work there was a place called Kensington Market, and I believe Brian used to work there as well. So both Freddie and Brian worked at Kensington Market in High Street, Kensington in London. And Freddie sold me some clothes. This is before he was a professional musician. He seemed like a very nice, sweet guy. And many years later, I was working with Steve Howe. I'm name dropping like crazy here. We had a band called GTR for a couple of years, Steve and I, and we had a hit single, "When the Heart Rules the Mind." and yeah, one of those MTV things. And we ended up, we were recording at the Townhouse in London, a well-known studio, and Queen were there recording as well. So we were doing our one and only GTR album, and they were there, and I had a birthday party, and the guys came along, so I got to meet them. I'd already met Brian and Roger in Brazil, because I spent quite a lot of time there, and I was there when they were doing Rock in Rio many years ago in the 1980s. So back in the early 1980s that was, and then of course GTR was mid 80s, and Brian and I ended up recording a couple of things together. There was an album called Feedback 86, which came out almost a decade later. And also we did something for, it was something called Rock Against Repatriation for the Vietnamese boat people. So
Right.
as we were recording together, doing a version of Sailing, which most people know as a Rod Stewart song, we were doing a version of that, and we were watching ourselves on TV Christmas Day as we were on the news doing that. And Brian's sitting there. How cool is that? We're on the news and we're recording right now. So that was quite a buzz. So there's a connection with some of the Queen guys. Obviously, a brilliant band, and I hope they manage to continue on in some shape or form, whoever they're working with.
Well, it's funny. We haven't talked about it, and I guess it's a great lead into it. When you think about your connections, you're obviously a lot more connected to another pack of cats. That so many people. You mentioned Eddie Van Halen. Well, when Eddie Van Halen heard your tapping technique and fell in love with it, you were part of Genesis. And in 1970, you had an ad in Melody Maker. There's a great story of the phone call that it leads to. If you could share that.
Yeah, well, I had an ad. I'd been when I first left school. I left school at 16, and then for 5 years I was advertising in the back pages of Melody Maker. This magazine formed many top British bands. That's how musicians got in touch with each other. I stuck in an ad which said something like imaginative guitarist, writer, seeks receptive musicians determined to strive beyond existing stagnant music forms. So I did something very wordy, a little kind of a bit like Winston Churchill's clarion call to arms. That's how I felt it was. I wanted to come across as an idealist, and I wanted people to know that I was driven and deadly serious about it. And so yeah, I didn't smile for the first 5 years, and then we took off, which was great.
And so that day, I mean, that's like Peter Gabriel himself calls you.
Yeah, that's right. And he said, we've got a band called Genesis. I don't know if you've ever heard of us. And I said, no. And that was it. So I think that because I wasn't easily impressed, that probably got me the gig, because I was able to be very honest and say, oh, I think this could potentially be strong. Not sure about this. I had no sense of diplomacy whatsoever, and I had no idea that they'd already auditioned 40 guitarists in quick succession. And if I'd have joined that bunch, I doubt whether I would have been the one they would have chosen. I would have gotten lost in the crush. But they visited me at home with my parents. They liked what they heard. Then I got to meet Mike Rutherford. This was Mike and Tony, first of all. Tony and Pete, first of all. Then they said, you must meet our other guitarist, Mike Rutherford. And he was living with his parents at the time. So we were all very young, you know what I mean? Everyone was either living at home or just about to leave home. And it was a very different world. They came from a very different background to me. I was a London boy. They were country boys, and also perhaps born with a certain amount of privilege. There was a very famous British school called Charterhouse. It's a bit like another Eton, you know what I mean? And I think they suffered a very harsh regime, floggings and crucifyings, and or to knock them into shape so that they could hold down a job as Viceroy of India. I think that's what they were trying to produce. They were trying to produce captains of industry and and politicians, prime ministers, they were not trying to produce rock and rollers, and that was extremely frowned upon. So, as I say, they had to suffer under the lash, but sometimes that can be very character forming, and it's the very thing, or the parallel example I like to think of as Rudolf Nureyev with his father trying to beat dancing out of him. Well, it ain't going to happen. If that's what you're going to do, that's what you're going to do. And it's sometimes you've got to fight against a lot just to be able to get in the door, it seems to me. But if you're born to do that, then you must be a heretic. And in order to establish your own church or even your own club, whatever it is, you've got to go there. If they're going to burn you at the stake, so what? That's the price of admission. Get out there and do it anyway.
Well, what's funny, because it ends up becoming this different background does not prevent Genesis' first #1 hit you write in the book, I Know What I Like, based on a riff that you played with Phil Collins, you wrote. And the question would be, did you and Phil ever spend any offstage personal time together that when you think back to it as you were researching the book, maybe after you did the book, stuff would come to mind, or just things that make you smile when you remember connecting with him as a guy back then?
Yeah, I mean, we were the new boys in Genesis at the time, and he, I don't know, he was a hit with the ladies. He was a real ladies' man at the time, and that was extraordinary because I'd really given up girlfriends in order to concentrate solely on music. He'd already had the experience of being on stage as the Artful Dodger in Lionel Bart's Oliver, which was this huge, successful British musical, based on Charles Dickens' Oliver the story. And so he'd already performed on stage as singer, dancer, actor, all of that. He'd been in films, but he wanted to give all of that up just to play drums. And other people wouldn't let him because they knew that he had a great voice. And you can't keep a great singer down, as you know. So, we were very close in the early days. And we shared many an evening going out together and hanging out together and going to see films. He took me to see Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet.
Wow.
And I said, now, why are we going to see this movie in the afternoon? He said, well, actually, I was up for the part of Romeo with my then girlfriend at the time. So this film was always held a special significance for me. Now, if he'd have become that Shakespearean actor right then and there, perhaps the world of rock would have seen a very different development, and perhaps Phil's Cockney vowels would have taken another turn, and it would have been Rhoda. It would have been different.
That's funny.
He would have had a different life. So Shakespeare was not to be. Shakespeare's failure is rock and roll success.
Hey, and yours too, my brother. Yours too, for sure. And equally, there's a great line that you have in this book. There's some really endearing stuff, especially about your parents. And I guess it's like your mom coming to that third show at the Lyceum and stuff. But then there's this thing, you're talking about Peter Gabriel, and you say it's during the time with Lamb Lies Down era when you knew that he was going to be leaving, and you said you were going to miss him like a brother. And I guess I would say, similarly, like you just did with Phil, so nice, give us a little anecdote about your time with him, and also, are you still close to either of these guys?
Yes, I'm full of admiration and respect and love for Pete. He was the guy who got me into Genesis. Without him making the phone call, it never would have happened. The guy bothered to call me up, took a chance on someone who was plainly, a mad professor. But he gave me that chance. And of course, in his development, not just as a musician, he invents this whole organization called Real World and becomes associated with WOMAD and a kind of musical philanthropy, in the same way that the Beatles invited in half of India, which changed the world. And Pete invited in, I think, largely, I'm thinking of Africa and giving those people a chance. And so he's going to be the go-to guy, isn't he? If there's some guy who's from a remote tribe in Ethiopia that just happens to play a mean washboard, he's going to give or try to give Pete Gabriel a call and come over and record or be on his label. So, time and time again, I'm coming across people I think, oh, that's an interesting musician, and it'll be that, But the thing is, we shared our phone book with each other. I mean, Pete wanted to go to Brazil and record musicians. He said, I guess I should ask you first, because can I have your phone book? And I said, yes, of course. Yeah. So that's it. He was collecting data. That's what he does. And I think, we've both tried to work with people across the globe, whether you've got a home team that you're working with, but you want to augment it with all these other exotic things that broaden rock's shoulders, or should I say music's shoulders, because it doesn't always have to be rock and roll. Not as we know it, Jim. You know what I mean? There has to be, it's got to expand. Rock has to grow up. It has to have all these other things informing it, or else it will wither and die on the vine, and it'll be something that Chuck Berry used to do. It can't afford to be a guilty pleasure. It has to grow up. The Beatles kind of showed us where it could go by the incorporation of ethnic musicians and orchestras. At the same time, they could still tell a really great story in a lyric. And of course, we know they had the world's ear and all of that. But I think, like the Beastie Boys say, you've got to fight for your right to party and or prog or whatever you do. You've got to, you've just got to get out there. Don't let anyone put you off. Just love what you do and keep it coming. And eventually, the walls of Jericho will come down, to the blast of your trumpet or your snare drum or your triangle.
Some great photos are in the book too. A solo high point, and you'll tell me maybe it's not the solo high point, but the photos at least of that last Royal Albert Hall show look stunning in there. That venue so mind-boggling. What would be a solo high point for you personally?
Solo high points. Yeah, I think there was that one. The Royal Albert Hall just happens to be this really extraordinary venue. Whatever is on at the Royal Albert Hall, you go and see it just to see the Royal Albert Hall. So whether you're watching wrestling, a dog show, or Gary Glitter, I mean, it was, and I saw all sorts of stuff there over time. I saw, Dvorak, the New World Symphony. I saw Johnny Cash.
Wow.
Stuff. I saw Jeff Beck there. I saw the Farewell Cream concert, the one they did, was it 1960, 1970? Way back in the day,
Wow.
might have been 69. I can't remember the exact year, but I remember being there for that, having been at one of their first early gigs in a club, and then see the final gig, to see that journey, the arc of that. So yes, certainly doing the Royal Albert Hall was a big deal. I mean, I played to larger crowds in Italy, for instance, but that was extraordinary. It's not the size of the venue, is it? It's about how deeply do you touch
That's right.
people. That's really what it's all about. It's not about the numbers. Yeah.
You mentioned a
Numbers.
benefit, actually. That's exactly what I was thinking about. And you don't say a lot about it, but it's with your band for Tadworth Court and the Children's Hospital. Who was featured
Yeah.
at that? Was that one of these kind of gigs that you're sort of talking about?
Well, yeah, that was great because we'd done this show where Genesis reformed to help Peter Gabriel, who rather grandly said when the WOMAD Festival lost a lot of money and a lot of the acts lost money, he said, well, I'll cover the debts. And it was something like £250,000, which would have equaled about $500,000 at that time. And it's a great grand gesture, except that he didn't have the money. And the record company at the time, Charisma Records, that we were all signed to, said, well, what if Genesis reformed to make that possible? And so everyone laid the ghost to rest, and we all showed up in some shape or form to do that show. Now, as a result of that, I said to Pete, I've got to do something for Tadworth Court. It's this hospital, which was associated with the Great Ormond Hospital for children in Great Ormond Street, which is basically it's associated with Peter Pan. Every time there is a performance of Peter Pan, nobody makes any money out of it. All the proceeds go to this hospital for children.
Wow.
And there's a Surrey arm of that called Tabworth Court that they were going to close. And I saw this mother on who had a terminally ill child, and she was in tears saying, I don't know what I'm going to do with this. So I thought, well, I've got to do something, and I organized a concert. Very kindly, Peter Gabriel agreed to be part of it, as did Mike Rutherford, and the band that I had at the time involved Ian Mosley, who had yet to join Marillion, but was going to, and my brother and Chaz Cronk and Nick Magnus. We were all part of that, and a number of businesses had gotten together and had given money and proceeds from that show, and the combination of everyone meant that place was allowed to stay open. So it was a small contribution, but it's nice to be able to do things for all the right reasons. It always makes, there's something tangible in the air, there's an excitement. It really was about that. It was unrepeatable, because I think that's about the only time I've been on stage with Pete doing what was the track now? Salisbury Hill, and we were doing the Four Tops Reach-Out. I'll be there as an encore.
Wow.
All that sort of stuff. A bit of I Know What I Like. Yeah, it was great fun. The band were on form, and it was for all the right reasons. As was the thing for Pete with WOMAD, of course. You know, that was important in 1982, long time ago now. But somehow, you know, the spirit's important with all of that stuff.
Well, I mean, when you have an autobiography like this, as we go to wrap it up, again, it's a incredible new book, A Genesis in My Bed, from Steve Hackett, and his tales of when he's growing up and Genesis and all these other incredible solo projects, a lot of stuff we've been talking about. There's some photos too, which I referenced at least once previously, but there's another great one in there for, it's kind of one of these, sort of as you were just talking, it made me think of it. It was 2014, I guess, the premiere of Together and Apart, and it shows all you guys standing on a staircase together. Do you remember when that was taken?
Yes, I do. Yeah, we did a thing. You know, we there was an album from it. There was an interview which was on British TV, and I still show it. All of that. We did an album. The whole Together and Apart thing, or some of the parts, all of that, where the tracks we'd done together were released, but then each of us who'd been involved with the band from 1971 to 75, we each gave 3 solo tracks. So I guess in a way it was a compilation that a lot of people would have already had, but nonetheless, it's a proud moment to be able to be part of that. It was a great band, and the music goes on. What can I tell you?
It's a great photograph. It's been a lot of fun talking with you, the great Steve Hackett.
Yes, you too.
And in these very, very strange times, I'm wishing you a lot of success on all of the projects and your continued creative output during this time at home that you have had, and hope that your tour, fingers crossed, in April of next year will be able to get rolling. And I hope you had fun today. We do appreciate it, my brother.
Had lots of fun doing it. Thank you so much, Dave. Nice talking to you. Give my love to Hawaii. Aloha, Steve Hackett. You may remember me from Genesis, GTR, and lots of other projects. But right now, I'm working on another project with Hawaii Public Radio. It's their pledge drive, and I'm asking you for some support. It was a thrill to be here with my friend Dave Lawrence. But it would be a much bigger thrill if you made a pledge, and thank you.
You're an animal. I give you a high five from 6 feet away. A 6 foot away, socially distanced high five. Don't want to.
Indeed. That's all we're doing, isn't it? Yeah. But great to talk anyway. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Steve. Stay safe, brother. Aloha.
You too. All the best. Aloha.
Bye-bye.